Following the Compromise of 1850 and the entering in of California to the Union, the next piece of the causes of the Civil War is the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Follows shortly after the passage of the Compromise of 1850. The Kansas and Nebraska Act is going to have impact on future territories and is going to further continue the United States down a path that leads towards civil war. Let's review. The details of the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, is that all future territory north of Missouri's southern border would be free. Congress wanted to continue to compromise because they were attempting to keep both northern and southern states happy as it related to slavery. Southern states wanted to maintain the institution, as we've discussed, and northern states wanted it to be abolished and wanted slavery to not be an institution that is protected, but something that is taken away. So Kansas was set to become a separate territory from Nebraska. This is not quite statehood yet for Kansas, but it's or Nebraska, but it's close. Kansas is located north of Missouri's southern border. It should be entered as free territory, not slave-owning territory. This is the line that we are determining in 1820. The line, the Missouri Compromise, is north. North of that line is Kansas and Nebraska, so it should be free. However, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to be passed in 1854. It's going to allow Kansas and Nebraska to pick whether or not they wanted slavery. This is an idea called popular sovereignty, or people being able to decide what they wanted in each state. They have the sovereignty, the freedom, and the popular means that the people get to choose, that people have the freedom to choose. In the context of American history, popular sovereignty is related to the selection of slavery. This leads into an argument that will be discussed in more detail over states' rights. And this argument is that states should have the right to decide for themselves what they want, not the federal government, because the federal government doesn't represent the states. This is true to an extent. However, we need to remember that in Congress, each state has both equal representation and representation based on population. So it's not to say that the federal government doesn't represent the people. People in the states wanted the states to be able to choose for themselves. So if you're in Tennessee, it's different than Mississippi, which is different than Georgia, which is different than Kentucky. Not, well, you have representation, so we're going to select this for you. This is the argument of states' rights. So the question then is how did the Kansas and Nebraska Act end the Missouri Compromise? Well, the Missouri Compromise stated that all territory would be free, not that all territory would be available for popular sovereignty or for the people to choose. So this is the idea. Popular sovereignty is the idea that ends the Missouri Compromise through the Kansas and Nebraska Act. The next important cause of the Civil War is the case against Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave that went with his master to Wisconsin Territory. And at the time when he moved from Missouri to Wisconsin, slavery was ended in Wisconsin. It was a northern state that abolished slavery. Dred Scott is going to return to Missouri, and when he does so, he is going to want to be a free man. So he's going to sue, and the case is going to go to the Supreme Court. Dred Scott is going to come back to Missouri because his owner dies, but his home is in Missouri. That's where he's from. So he wants to return to Missouri. And what's going to end up happening is that he is going to sue against his owner's family. It's actually his owner's wife's family for his freedom by arguing that his time in Wisconsin freed him from slavery because it was abolished, even though he was born and bought into slavery in Missouri. So the two important questions that the Supreme Court hears is, can slaves who aren't citizens sue to the Supreme Court? Second is, does Dred Scott's time in Wisconsin make him a free man? This is a depiction of Dred Scott. One of the interesting things about the case, and if we had more time to look at, we would, is that Dred Scott is going to be motivated by his wife to sue. It was actually her idea, but because of the time, they felt like his case would be stronger than her case, and that's largely only because of her gender. Unfortunately, she couldn't sue for her freedom, but Dred Scott was hoping that this would become a precedent, and he and his wife and his kids would all become free as a result. So we're actually going to end up dropping the case against Dred Scott's wife, and pursuing this one instead. So the Supreme Court has to answer these two questions in Dred Scott v. Stanford. So in 1857, the Supreme Court is going to rule against two things. Number one is that Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom in federal court because he was not a citizen. They argue that this is the case for all people, including people who are free. So this does not have to do with him being a slave. It has to deal with him not being a citizen. And unfortunately, at the time, many, many freed slaves and many African Americans were unable to become citizens. So this totally removes an important freedom that citizens and people who live in the United States have, which is the equal protection under the law. But Dred Scott was denied this by the Supreme Court in 1857. The second thing that it's going to do is it's going to declare the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, essentially stating that the federal government did not have the right to declare that territories north of Missouri's southern border could be free. The Supreme Court is going to argue that this is to be left up to the states. This is another important decision made by the Supreme Court that benefits people who argued that states' rights was the biggest cause of the Civil War. The second to last cause of tension leading up to the Civil War is violence in Congress. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was a staunch abolitionist. Sumner was one of the leading political figures that was looking to abolish slavery. He is going to criticize and mock a fellow senator on the Senate floor. His name was Andrew Butler of South Carolina. He is arguing, he being Sumner, is going to mocking Butler for preventing Kansas from being a free state. Word is going to get around that Sumner mocked Butler, and Preston Brooks, a representative from South Carolina, is going to enter the Senate chamber after the meeting was over and beat Sumner with a cane from behind. He's going to leave Sumner almost paralyzed. He's going to leave Charles Sumner with maimed and with a ton of bodily injuries. Here's a political cartoon of Preston Brooks fighting against Charles Sumner. You can notice that the scroll in his hand says Kansas down here. You'll also notice that he's still writing it. You'll notice that there are people who want this to stop, but there are also people who are laughing and cheering it on. And the title of the writing of the political cartoon says Southern Chivalry, Argument versus Clubs, essentially saying that this is the way that the Southerners made decisions, was with a cane and not with arguments. And so this political cartoon by this artist is depicting and showing not only the beating of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks, but it's also making an argument about how Southerners interacted with arguments and things that they disagreed with violently, and we're going to see that in the next couple of discussions when Lincoln gets elected and the fighting actually starts.